This is the world famous Hadrian's Wall, a great Roman construction which stretched from one sea to the other across what is today northern England and marks the very northern boundary of the great Roman Empire. Now, we're taught at school that when the Romans invaded Britain, they marched all the way to the very top of Scotland, but then retreated back to this line here because those northern tribes were causing them just too many problems in a very difficult Scottish terrain, and the Romans didn't have enough resources to keep them subdued. Now, this was the northern boundary of the Roman Empire, but not for very long, only for about 14 years, because in the year 138, Emperor Hadrian died, and the new emperor decided this wasn't good enough. He wanted to push the northern boundary even deeper into the land of the barbarians. Emperor Hadrian had been a consolidating ruler, meaning he spent most of his time securing the boundaries of his empire. He spent a lot of time and effort building walls like this, most of them in far sunnier climes than here. But Emperor Antoninus Pius was a bit more daring. He believed the empire was strong enough to push those frontiers even further backwards into the territory of their enemies. And he considered this bothersome chunk of northern Britain to be worth testing. Unlike Hadrian, who actually visited northern Britain, Titus alias Hadrianus Antoninus Pius, otherwise known as Antoninus Pius, never travelled this land himself, but he was assured by the best scouts, military strategists and map makers at the time that the narrow neck of land between the Firth of Clyde and the Firth of Forth would make a suitable border wall. He ordered the creation of a wall here in the year 142, and its construction was overseen by the governor of Britannia at the time, a man called Quintus Lollius Urbicus, who hailed from what is today Libya and was thought to be a Berber by ethnicity. Urbicus easily conquered the lowlands north of Hadrian's Wall, and construction of the Antonine Wall began. Now, unlike Hadrian's Wall, there are fewer less impressive remains of the Antonine Wall, and to be honest, mostly it's disappeared completely. But here on the northern outskirts of Glasgow, we find this, the stone foundation. And this tells us something very, very important indeed. It tells us that the Romans probably intended the Antonine Wall to be made of stone, like Hadrian's Wall. It's not just an earthwork, it is stone. It's got a stone foundation. There's a little bit more over here, which is quite impressive. There's two sections of it in this cemetery alone. That suggests that the Romans wanted another solid stone wall to act as a stranglehold across the neck of Scotland. But it seems they changed their mind. Instead, they went for a more basic construction of turf and timber. Still imposing and still one of the biggest undertakings ever in Britain until that time. And here at Bar Hill, you can still see the impact it's had on the landscape. And this is the fort at Bar Hill, one of the best preserved on the route today, and quite small actually. Home to about 100 men, this little hilltop, but look at the view. Over there, you can see why they built it just here, such a prominent hill overlooking such a long, wide valley. Enemies can be seen from miles away. Right, so this little lump of land I'm on now is an old Iron Age hill fort known as Castle Hill, and it's right next to Bar Hill Roman Fort and the Antonine Wall running down there. And from here, ancient people could see all along the valley. Look at that, what a view. Which is why the Romans occupied this site and why they chose this range of hills going that way to build the Antonine Wall. It was perfect. At approximately 63 kilometres long, the wall was about 3 to 4 metres high and 5 metres wide. A deep ditch on the northern side was also cut, giving the wall extra protection. 17 forts and a number of smaller fortlets were constructed along its length to house the 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers manning the wall, controlling trade and subduing the local population. A small service road was built just to the south, allowing troops and supplies to move efficiently along its length. Altogether, the project took 12 years, which is a long time even for the ancient world. Hadrian's Wall had taken half the time. And this was a project that was probably a bit of a white elephant. Now, it's easy to say that the Antonine Wall was an attempt by the Romans to simply push the frontier further back, but it was probably motivated more by the ego of Antoninus Pius and the greed for more land than any necessity for self-preservation. This is what the Roman Empire looked like under Hadrian. From this perspective, it seems odd that the northern section of Britain would be left unconquered when it was such a small part of a small island. The Scottish Highlands might be incredibly hard to govern and control, but this was an empire that edged the Sahara Desert, that spanned the Alps and butted up against the territories of the great forests of Germania. Born in southern Spain, Hadrian had always considered that the empire was big enough, that it needed to secure the territory it already had, rather than swallowing more. Throughout his reign, Hadrian spent little time in Rome, instead preferring to travel the length and breadth of his empire and getting to know the regional and local problems. Hadrian worried that the future of the empire could only be secured if the people within it were prosperous, and the constant rebellions and localized unrest gave him enough of a headache. Controlling so much territory and holding power over so many different peoples was hard enough. Antoninus Pius, on the other hand, was the son of a senator and born just outside of Rome. Raised in privilege, Antoninus worked his way up the political system, becoming a consul and then finding favour with Hadrian. After the death of his son, Hadrian adopted Antoninus as his heir. And as someone who had not been near battle, it seems fitting that Antoninus' early years as emperor oversaw one of the most peaceful periods in Rome's history. Only a few rebellious people really threatened his peace, one of which was the Brigantes from the land south of Hadrian's Wall, in what is today northern England. Antoninus Pius had not made any military conquests of his own at this point and must have looked at this map, or this kind of version at the time, and wondered why his predecessor had left such an annoyingly small part unconquered. Perhaps desperate to flex his muscles and show his worth as a ruler, it seems Antoninus looked at northern Britain and thought it was worth a punt. He'd move the wall further northwards. And like any construction project today, it would cost a lot of money, which would constantly need finding and justifying. Now, you could argue that the Antonine Wall was shorter than Hadrian's Wall and therefore should have cost less to maintain and look after. But actually occupying the lowlands of Scotland between here and Hadrian's Wall cost a lot of money to police and maintain the subjugation of the native populations. Now, Roman soldiers were well paid for the time. So what did the Romans actually gain financially from occupying that extra land? And was it enough to cover the extra costs? And it's also wrong to say that this was the Romans against the Scots. The Scots didn't really exist, not as we know them today. All this was tribal lands, many of them rivals. And the wall itself cut right through those lands without regard to territorial or ancestral heritage, on an unstoppable journey from one sea to the other. Right, so where I am now is somewhere outside Camelon, which is about 12 miles to the east of Bar Hill Roman Fort. And as you can see, this is a fantastically preserved section of the Antonine remains. This is the ditch what I'm walking in right now, and look how high the turf side is just up there, 4 or 5 metres. That is the side which was the defensive wall. This side is just an extra earthwork, but look how high that is. And it would have been turf all the way down. You can see it running for quite a distance along here. On top of that would have been just a wooden fence basically, but it was enough to intimidate and keep out local people who wanted to attack. But in the early 160s, after just a decade or so of occupation, the Romans decided to abandon the wall here and retreat all the way back to Hadrian's Wall. The Antonine Wall was no longer the northern frontier of the empire. This great undertaking ended up being just a rather protracted incursion into Caledonian territory, and barely worth a mention in the history of Britain. The reasons the Romans abandoned this wall are not really well known, though historians guess it's a mixture of just not really getting enough value for money from occupying the land around here, plus making some clever pacts and treaties with the local tribes. It was cheaper and easier to play politics with the people they were subjugating, a lesson that would resonate with later Roman emperors and even many rulers today. And because it was largely a turf and timber construction, it slowly began to disappear from the landscape. This once great human construction, a mighty symbol of Roman power and ambition, slowly rotting away in the harsh, cold rain and wind of northern Britain. The Antonine Wall seems to represent a failed attempt to push the boundaries of the empire further northwards. Both walls, in fact, seem to be constructed to keep the enemy out. But what if we're thinking about this all wrong? What about the enemy within? What if both the Antonine and Hadrian's Wall weren't just built to keep enemies from the north of here from attacking and raiding deep into Roman territory? What if they were built to keep enemies to the south of here, within Roman Britain, from fleeing northwards to safety? Roman Britain, after all, was occupied territory, and occupied territories inspire freedom fighters and inspire a fight for justice. South of here, what is today England, would have been full of warriors angry at the presence of the Roman soldiers, and who would attack and raid where they could, and then flee northwards to the safety of the Scottish lowlands. With that in mind, Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall, like all walls, were built to keep control of those who are subdued, to trap those inside who want to flee, to split apart families, and to claim disputed territory. And we still see this today. Walls are constructed to keep people apart, to control the movement of communities, to subdue, to annex land, to divide, and to conquer. The two great Roman walls of Britain were political decisions made by leaders in order to divide a people they were wanting to control. They weren't really about defence, but more about manipulation. And I think that's worth remembering. They make great tourist sites today, but there's a darker side to these walls, and it's something we often overlook or don't like to think about. But maybe it's time that we should.